Welcome, everybody. Can anyone give me a thumbs up if you can hear clearly? Great. Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us for this very special event sponsored by Main Line Yoga Shala. We're so grateful, and quite honestly, it gives us such hope that 180 people registered for tonight's event. So thank you all for being with us. I'd like to do a short introduction to introduce my friend, Dr. Nathalie Edmond. Nathalie is a licensed clinical psychologist and an experienced yoga teacher. She has been in the therapy world for 20 years. She completed her 300-hour yoga teacher training at Main Line Yoga Shala, and that is how I originally got to really get to know Nathalie. Dr. Edmond specializes in the treatment of trauma from a mind-body-spirit approach. Social justice is centered in her work, and she has a variety of trainings on diversity and inclusion and developing an anti-racist identity. She enjoys bringing a mindful and compassionate approach to difficult conversations to help everyone awaken and be free. She is the owner of a group practice in Ewing, New Jersey, called Mindful and Multicultural Counseling. And I just want to take a moment here to just say, I have been participating as a participant in anti-racism work over the past 2 to 3 years. And Nathalie is truly a gifted presenter in this field. She has presented in our yoga teacher training modules, and I'm really excited for all of you to get to hear her speak. And I feel such deep gratitude that she has been willing to share with us her expertise and her insight. So thank you so much, Nathalie, for being with us. I'm gonna make you the host right now and give you over the mic.
Thank you, Erica. So appreciate the welcome and the invitation to be with all of you virtually. It's heartening to me to see so many people engaged in dialogues, because I think that's the beginning of the work, is just to start to uncover all that we've been taught that is perhaps not true, or perhaps is true from a certain lens. So I invite us into this dialogue thinking about the gifts that yoga and therapy have given to me. And I think that is the willingness to look at things that potentially are painful and to allow myself to be more vulnerable, not only in my relationships, but in the world. And so that's an invitation I have for all of you. And I think about change happens when we allow ourselves to be brave and courageous. And so I invite you to take a step in that bravery, that by perhaps renaming yourself on Zoom. So you'll see that I have renamed myself. I have my first name, my race, and my preferred pronouns. So I invite you to perhaps do that. If you don't know how to rename yourself, you can just hover over your square. You'll probably see 3 dots, and then you can start to rename yourself if you're so willing, if that feels right for you tonight. And I just think about, so often we don't name race. We don't name the invisible. And we assume a lot of things about people's genders. And so inviting us to not do that, right? And when I think of race, right, I think of white, Black, Indigenous, I think of Asian, I think of Latinx, right? And so thinking about if any of those, or perhaps it's biracial, so there's multiple races, or multiracial. So just thinking about, do any of those stick out for you, right? So just inviting you into a few moments of meditation, just to arrive into the space. So finding a comfortable seat to be in for a little bit, in whatever shape feels right. Something that allows you to be alert, but not rigid or stiff. And you can have a soft gaze, or perhaps close the eyes if that feels right. And I just think about the amount of time we spend looking at screens, and perhaps you might notice that maybe your neck and shoulders need a little bit of movement just to settle in a little bit more. So feeling free to move the shoulders around in circles or do half or full neck rolls just to loosen up a little bit. And starting to tune into your senses. Feeling your feet touching the ground. Feeling the support of whatever you're sitting on. Feeling the air touching your skin. Taking in the sounds around you is just part of the experience. Tuning into the taste buds in your mouth. And the flow of the breath in and out. Perhaps each inhale is just an invitation of curiosity. And each exhale is just a settling in just a little bit more. Welcoming all parts of yourself into this virtual space. Welcoming the parts you adore. Welcoming the parts you struggle with. Welcoming your curious parts. Your rebellious parts. Welcoming a full range of emotions. And just noticing what weighs heavily on you tonight. What might you be grateful for? Coming in once again to the flow of the breath in and out. This breath that we might take for granted. Perhaps in the stillness, just whispering your name. Perhaps whispering the name of a loved one. Whispering the name of a neighbor. I offer you a few names to consider. Romaine Brisbane. Tamir Rice. Akai Gurley. Michael Brown. John Crawford. Eric Garner. Jonathan Farrell. Sandra Bland, Ahmad Arbery, Brianna Taylor, George Floyd, holding their families who lost them too soon. Imagine stepping into the skin of the mothers, fathers, sisters, brothers, children, or families of one of these men, women, or children. What do you experience in your body, your mind, your heart? What if these were one of your loved ones? What if one of your loved ones killed one of these people on the list? Noticing what arises as I read you this untold story about racism that led to the murders of these Black lives. A story that we are often not told, but perhaps we should start to tell these stories. My dear one, I'd like to tell you from my lips the truth about our racial history, our white history, about whiteness and about being a member of the white tribe. Years ago, our ancestors did a horrific deed against the human race. They owned Black people as slaves and treated them with utter disrespect. Beatings, rape, torture, lynching, ongoing terror. We sold their children to the highest bidders and owned them as possessions. And we relied on them to grow our food and take care of our children. Your ancestors. Yes, our people did this, white people. Not only did we do this to Blacks, we also did hateful things to people who we felt were substandard, like American Indians, Mexicans, Jews, Japanese, Chinese, and poorer people than we were. It's true that the greatness of this country, to a large extent, is due to the slave labor of Blacks, and we owe them a huge debt. We have, as a white race, disenfranchised them and systematically organized to keep them from participating in and benefiting from the wealthiest country in the world. Our success, however big or small, and the many privileges we enjoy as a family are rooted in this stained and denied history. Even to this day, our people benefit from the institutional practices that intentionally and systematically oppress Black and other dark bodies. Many poor white people feel that they are better than Black people, even better than the first Black president of the United States. Being ashamed about this is not as helpful as understanding that we have a lot of work to do to begin to respect Blacks and dark lives, to release and share the wealth and privilege we have for all they have given to us as white people. Blacks and other people of color are rightfully angry toward us because of the centuries of hatred and disrespect we have shown them. We have continued as a collective to build prisons to hide and erase them, instead of facing the years of hatred toward them and shame toward ourselves that have resulted in destroyed hearts, minds, and communities. Most important, we have died inside as a result of making hatred normal as a race. We have become numb, dismembered, crude and unloving toward our own race, because we cannot access the depth of love as a collective. It's such a stained and unfinished history of disrespect and hatred toward other humans. What this means to you and me is that we must wake up to this history and own that we walk with great ease in this country on their still sore backs, backs we whipped into submission. What we witness today is the Black collective expression, is the result of generations of Blacks who have witnessed their parents and grandparents killed, lynched, raped by our men, and hated and disrespected by us. They were helpless against it. We made sure of that. You need to understand, my child, that while we have other fears, we tend to walk without racial fear, and they don't. This world is not safe for them and other people like them, dark people. And it is because of our history, our whiteness. To this day, we have better schools and access, and we still are the central race in all aspects of respectable society, work, and leadership. Black communities are largely poor, and their schools are disenfranchised because we have kept them at a disadvantage. Many of them are considered criminals, even though they are not doing anything more than we do in our communities. Yet they are imprisoned and used again as slave labor. Many whites want to maintain white supremacy, and there continues to be white nationalist rallies and terror attacks on other races near and far, currently emboldened by senior members of the government. We have done horrible things as a white race, unspeakable things. Yet we have not spoken or been honest with each other or ourselves as a white race. While you and I may not have done these things personally, this is our history and our inheritance. Our challenge is to do everything humanly possible to recognize and interrupt any act of disrespect and unearned privilege, and to use our voices, our bodies, and our hearts to make this wrong right. We need this in order to be free. This does not mean kissing up to Blacks or anything else, although it may seem that way. Rather, it means a willingness to face into the pain they carry because we've been so cavalier, numb, and blind to the role we have played in the past and present horror of their lives. Our job now and for a long time is to own up to it, apologize, and recognize that their expressed pain is not directed to you or me as an individual, but to us as a white race. And as the institutional power that continues to oppress them, often through our ignorance, greed, comfort, righteousness, and indifference. I tell you this because you may well receive much disdain from Black people. They may not trust you. When they see you, they are also seeing our unclaimed and terrorizing history. They see you as someone who, like our forefathers, hated them, and they see our ignorance. The way we casually delight in a disowned and forgotten history, a history where we consider them as less than human, as possessions, as chattel. This history wasn't that long ago. They are and should be hurt and angry by our utter neglect and generational hatred. There is much to be done. There is no time for guilt and shame. We must forgive ourselves and correct this wrong. We must become advocates for all of humanity, especially Black and dark-skinned lives. Enough said for now, but we will speak of this again and again and again. So those are the words of Ruth King. I'll leave some time for questions in the last 20 minutes or so, and I'll do a brief presentation and just allow you to continue to let that just settle into your body and just notice what arises. So in order for us to become anti-racist, we first have to own the history of this country. Can people see my slides? A nod? Yes, awesome, cool. All right. So this conversation today is everything through the lens of race. So this country was founded on white supremacy, right? So this idea that people left Europe in order to be free, in order to have opportunity to build wealth. And so they came to a land that already had indigenous people. And instead of making friends with them and learning all that they knew, they decided to take from them and basically eradicate most of the indigenous people of this land. And if you read the history, you see that people who were not white when they came to this country, they were Scottish and Irish, and English, and Italian. They had ethnicities. That part of their indoctrination into whiteness was to, over time, give up their ethnic identity in some fashion to assume whiteness. So most people were persecuted when they came to this country and eventually achieved the privilege of white supremacy. So white supremacy, we often think, is individuals who are extremists. But white supremacy is really a system. It's a network. It's a racial hierarchy in which whiteness is privileged and at the top. And everything surrounds whiteness. And whiteness interacts with religion and gender and sexual orientation. And if you even look at the notes for the Declaration of Independence, one of the things that people wanted in order to separate from England was that England was moving away from slavery. And those individuals who first came to found what is now known as the United States wanted to still be able to do slavery, to enslave people in order to build their wealth. So we have this system of white supremacy, that from that system comes white privilege. So the way that it's helpful for me to understand white supremacy is that even though if I was white, even if we eradicated all the white supremacist groups, white supremacy would continue because it's built into just about every fabric of our society. It's built into our laws, it's built into our educational system, it's built into our housing because of the history of redlining, which helped segregate so much of the United States. So I couldn't decide between this and this. So there are different pyramids about white supremacy. So the reason I like this one is I think it's a great graphic about what white supremacy really looks like. So what we're used to thinking of white supremacy is everything that's at the top of the pyramid. So those are overt acts of racism. So that's lynching, swastikas, hate crimes, KKK, saying the N-word, burning of crosses, neo-Nazis, racist jokes. So all of that is, until the last several years, was not really socially acceptable to do anymore. Once upon a time it was, but in the last several years, after the civil rights, it really was not okay to do. And then you'll see a line, and then everything below that is more socially acceptable acts of white supremacy. And these are things that most of us, unless we take an anti-racist lens, have done at some point. So I'll just name a few of them, right? Slogans like "Make America Great Again," hiring discrimination, police murdering people of color, racial profiling, anti-immigration policies, denial of white privilege, denial that racism exists, tokenism, colorblindness, being a white savior, expecting people of color to teach white people, a Eurocentric curriculum, This idea of meritocracy, right? That I earned all of this stuff. Culturally appropriating people's culture, not challenging racist jokes, using racist mascots, saying, don't blame me, I never owned slaves, celebration of Columbus Day, assuming that good intentions are enough without thinking about the impact. So I like this slide because it talks about this is all on a continuum, right? So at the top is genocide, so we're killing people, but at the bottom is indifference, right? Just being neutral or not caring, but that is a part of what keeps white supremacy going. So we all participate in white supremacy in one way or another, whether we are white or a person of color, we all participate. And until we awaken to just how much it's out there, it's really hard to make changes. So I actually did a variation of this presentation back in 2016. I did this presentation in Princeton, and it was about educating people about the Black Lives Matter movement. So I think it's helpful when people are saying Black Lives Matter that they have an understanding of what that actually means and what the premise of the Black Lives Matter movement was. So the Black Lives Matter movement started in 2012 by 3 queer Black women, Alicia Garza, Patrisse Cullors, and Opal Tometi. And Patrisse Cullors has written a book, When They Call You a Terrorist, which I highly recommend. So this was created after George Zimmerman was acquitted for murder of Trayvon Martin, and much of the trial focused on blaming the victim. And then there were continued deaths. So each of these women had lost a loved one at the hands of a police officer or somebody else. And it's years later and we're still seeing the same things. And so this was a call to action against institutionalized and systemic racism. So the premise of the Black Lives Movement was that it goes beyond just the killings of Black people by police. It's an end to mass incarceration, which tends to predominantly affect Black, Indigenous, and people of color. It's a commitment to invest in schools that serve Black children. It's about economic investments in communities of color, decrease militarized policing that makes communities of color feel unsafe, and increase community policing. Active participation of Black people in the decisions that impact their lives and communities. So they don't want white saviors, they want a seat at the table. They actually want to kind of blow up the table because the table was not built for them to ever have a seat there. And it supports causes of queer Black people because many of us know that queer, trans, people of color die at a high rate, or they're murdered at a high rate. So these are all the history of why the Black Lives Movement was needed. And much of that is the undoing racism story that I read to you. So these are some of the myths about the Black Lives Matter movement, right? That it's this idea of all lives don't matter, right? That's not true, right?
You're driving over there.
The idea is that all lives do matter, and we have to center the voices of Black people because history has said that they don't matter. And it's not about being anti-police, it's just about policing in a different way. Not anti-white people, it's just about recognizing white supremacy as how it lives in our history, in our system. And it doesn't, most of the protesting is peaceful. Okay. I think I've muted everybody, so cool. So thinking about what does it mean to be an ally? Because I think many of you are interested in doing that or already that. And I know what I've heard in some circles is the worry that what we're seeing right now, people standing up for Black lives, people protesting, people learning about the history, people owning it, people being willing to take a stand in a different way, that perhaps that will not last past this new cycle. So I'll show you two different continuums. So this is the continuum of allyship. So on one end is like not really caring or understanding the issues, then starting to be aware, then starting to be active. So you're starting to really share and seek diversity when asked or prompted, and then you move to advocate or accomplice, whichever language you prefer. And that it's so easy to move back and forth. I know I've done it in the course of my lifetime, move back and forth. Sometimes I care more, sometimes I have more energy. I really love this, which is how to become an anti-racist. Because I think for a long time, at least a good chunk of my adulthood and childhood, was that colorblindness was the thing. We're all equal, we're all the same. And yet the reality says that's not actually true. And so this thing of anti-racist is a very active stance. So I think about the different stages we move through. So we see the first stage is the fear zone, which is I deny racism as a problem, I avoid hard questions, I strive to be comfortable, I talk to others who look and think like me, right? Which is the legacy of segregation, right? That if you don't have much interaction with people who look different than you or who are racially different, then sure, you would have a lot of fear, because where are you getting your knowledge from? Then we move to the learning zone, where you start to understand your racial identity as a group. You seek out questions that make you uncomfortable. You're a little bit more vulnerable about your own biases and what you don't know. You listen to others who think and look differently than you. And then you move to the growth zone, which is this outer layer, where you really become an advocate. You identify how you may unknowingly benefit from racism. You educate your peers about how racism harms. You don't let mistakes deter you from getting better, right? You let go of perfectionism and having all the right words. You use your privilege and your power to lift up the voices that tend not to be heard. And you surround yourself with others who look different than you and who think differently than you. So I think about what can people do? And I think there are all kinds of ways to be anti-racist. For some of us, we love to go to protests and rallies. We love to call our local police department or send a letter to them. We love to call our senators and our congresspeople. We write letters. Others of us, we spend time frequenting Black, Indigenous, people of color businesses. We take time to build relationships with people who are different than us. We talk about race with our friends and our families. We have the talk with our children, all of our children. Because if my children are with your children, I want your children, if you're white, to understand how the choices they make could put my kid in jeopardy. So we all should have the talk. We start to critically examine anti-Blackness culture, because it's everywhere. And once you awaken, you start to see it everywhere. You challenge jokes and discrimination when you see and hear it. You notice your own privilege and see yourself as part of a group rather than an individual. You may not have personally done this or held slaves. Your family may not have. But if you're white, you benefit from it in so many different ways. You challenge yourself to be uncomfortable. You read different sources and diverse authors. You don't burden your friends of color with teaching you about history. You find other sources for that. I love this one. You drop your credentials, your smugness, your separateness, right? I was in this other training earlier today where I was a participant, and there was a white cis male psychologist who spent the first minute giving his credentials, right? He was telling he was a psychologist, he had a lot of Black friends, he's been doing this stuff for a long time. And it was like, why was all of that necessary, right? He had the best of intentions, but a room full of people of color just didn't want to hear it, right? And so this idea of smugness, of like, if we're on a certain level of the continuum, we think we've arrived, and then we look back at other people and we kind of shame them or look down at them, but we were once there too. And so how do we bring them along in the most loving way that we can? We donate to those already doing the work, right? So I'm going to just open up the floor for questions, comments, things like that. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. So if you want to write your name, your question in the chat box, or write your name, and then I'm happy to call on you to hear your question or hear your comments. What do I mean by being a white savior? Great question. So white savior, I think of as, once I have a certain, if I'm a white identifying, once I have a certain understanding of how bad it is for Black, Indigenous, people of color, I start to try to rescue them. I try to start to do all these things to make their life better. But it becomes, instead of lifting up their voices, I am the voice, right? And it makes me feel better that I'm helping them versus inviting them to the conversation and opening up doors for them, creating space or protecting them so that they can ask for what they need. That's what I think of as white savior. It benefits you more so than it benefits the person you're trying to help. But it's good intentions, but the impact is that people of color still feel disempowered. And I've also seen at times, so even in the recent, the call for defunding the police, right? That I've heard commentary by white allies about, I don't know if that's the right phrase that they should be using, right? So there's like a critiquing of how people are asking for what they need. Like if people are too angry, if people are saying something that rubs people the wrong way, that they should tone it down in some way. Ooh, I love all these questions. What is an appropriate age to have the talk with children? Ooh, I think as young as you can. I imagine the talk looks different at age 2 versus 3 versus 10. But to have, I think so often what happens is people don't, because of color blindness, people don't talk about race. They don't name it. And so I think we create a culture in which people think it's taboo to talk about race, or people never build the resilience to be able to have those conversations. And so I think if you're starting to talk about race with your kids early on, then it's a natural progression to have the talk. I think about for my son, we had the talk with him at age 9. We had already talked about race before that, but age 9 is when Black boys tend to start to be criminalized. Instead of being cute, they start to be viewed as threat. And so we wanted him to have an awareness that his beautiful Black body would be seen as a threat, and that I needed him to make certain choices so that he could come home alive, right? And so, but that was built on a foundation of already having talked to him about race long before that. I'm a Black therapist, and I'm wondering, how do you recommend working with white clients who have different views on this movement than you do? That's a tough one. I mean, I think just opening the dialogue, right? Just naming race, right? Like I think about when I work with white clients, I think about, I probably went through a period of time where I didn't really talk about race with white clients. I almost always talk about race with Black clients or people of color. And, but particularly I think with this movement and all that's been happening in the era of COVID-19, that just inviting white people to reflect on how they're experiencing everything that's happening. It starts the beginning of a conversation, and I think a therapy room is the best place to start that if you're in a mental space where you can hold that space, because I think it can be draining, particularly as a Black therapist, to hold space for white people who may not really have any understanding of white privilege. On the slide about the Black Lives Movement, is the word color used synonymously with Black, or does this movement include Black lives and other people of color? Great question. So the way that I think of the Black Lives Matter movement is that because the foundation of the United States is built on an anti-Black culture, that if Black lives truly do matter, then all lives really do matter. So if we can address the anti-Blackness culture, then other people of color could benefit from that, and white people could benefit from that. So I tend to move back and forth between Black and people of color. I really like the phrase BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, people of color, which I think is like the quickest way to name all of those people who are non-white. How can my white children protect Black children? What do I teach them specifically? Ooh, that's like a whole other talk all by itself. I think if you read them the untold story of racism, right? I mean, that's a story written for white children, right? If you read that to them and built on conversations about that, and having an understanding of policing was created to police slaves, runaway slaves. And so if you understand that the society is based on racism, and that if your kids were, let's say, in a car with other Black people, that you want to make sure that they are protected, right? So protected might mean speaking up, right? Because white people are heard differently than Black people. So teaching your children to, one, recognize that white people and Black people are treated differently, particularly by the legal system. So like I would teach my son and daughter, I don't ever want you driving a bunch of white kids, because you get pulled over, it's you. You can be a passenger, but I don't ever want you to be driving a car full of white people, because they will get off scot-free more than likely, and you will be in trouble. So it's about being aware of what's in your surroundings, and understanding that you'll be treated differently. If you think, oh, we're all the same and we're all equal, then that's a problem. Performative allyship. Yes, so this is a phrase that's coming around a lot, which is this idea of it's easy in like this period of time to post on your social media, Black Lives Matter. It's easy to post a video, post an article, but are you in for the long haul, right? Are you willing to have in-person conversations with people in your circle of influence? Are you willing, a year from now, 6 months from now, when the next news cycle has moved through, to still be allies, to still hear what people have to say? So this idea of reforming policing, what can you do to support that? Because that's what the Black community is saying they want. That's what they've been saying they've wanted for a long time. And the Black Lives Matter movement started in 2012. And that was just, it was formalized. It was around long before that. So this idea of where were all these allies all these years? George Floyd was not the first Black man to be killed. We have smartphones now, so we can film this stuff. But this stuff has been going, I mean, I didn't see it. I didn't watch the video, but there's, you know, that was modern day lynching that happened there, right? And so there's so many other Black, Indigenous, people of color who experience similar things, but maybe they don't end up dying. But that this is probably an everyday occurrence in our country. It's just we're not aware of it, or we choose not to see it. Is it ever appropriate to ask my Black family or friends any questions about how I can be a better ally, or do you recommend never doing so? I think it's all about timing, right? So I think about, like, if I just think about people who have reached out to me in the last couple of weeks, for some people who have reached out, it has felt like a burden. And for other people, it has felt really supportive, right? And so I think about, and so I think part of it is like sometimes people reach out of guilt and shame, and other times they reach out because they genuinely care about how I'm doing, right? And so to me, I can feel the difference, right? Like, I don't want to do emotional labor with you, but if like we've been in this, and I think that's the performative allyship, right? Like I have this book club that I've had for years, an anti-racism book club. And so the people in that book club, I'd see them as true allies because they've been doing the work. We've been engaging in these dialogues. The people who are just showing up now, I don't know if you're in it for the long haul. I don't know if it, like, you know, at the end of the summer, you'll have moved on to something else while Black lives will still be dying. And so thinking about if you have a true, authentic relationship with someone of a different race, to me, true intimacy is to be able to talk about race, right? And if it's a part of your relationship, then why wouldn't you ask them about how you can be a better ally? Because it comes from genuine intimacy versus I feel really guilty right now and I want you to help me feel better. So I think it's really context. Sure, you can unmute to ask a question. The bootstrap theory. So bootstrap is, I pulled myself up by the bootstrap. So this idea of like individual control and power, right? So you might have started with nothing, but you worked really hard, maybe you worked a lot of jobs, you really toiled, and that's how you inherited your wealth or your status, which takes you out of the social system of white supremacy, right? That this idea of even across centuries, even at the height of slavery, there were always exceptions, right? There were free colored people at that time. And so there have always been exceptions. And so some of it is luck, right? And some of it is a system, right? So white supremacy or white privilege gives people access to certain things. It makes the journey a little bit easier. Even if you come from poorness, your white skin gives you certain privileges. It opens doors that are invisible to other people. And so we have to keep that in mind, that the system of white supremacy makes it easier for white people to achieve things, right? I even just think about legacy, right? That like if you go to a certain college, it's more likely that your kids will probably be able to go to that college, right? Like that's part of the system. Like it grants people access, and your kid may not be that great of a student, but because you were able to do it and your grandfather was able to do it, your grandmother, then you have easier access to that. What's an acceptable way to refer to someone's race when you don't know their heritage, but do not want to speak colorblind and to celebrate people's differences and identities? I would just ask, right? I mean, that's part of my invitation for people to write their name, their race, and their preferred pronouns, because I think our brains like to just figure it out, but that's based on certain assumptions, right? Like, oh, they have certain features or they have a certain skin tone, when we really don't know. And so I would encourage people to ask, right? I think it becomes like, how do we become more comfortable with talking about race? What are the more subtle ways in which white people are racist? Can you give some examples? So what's so interesting is I was reading this article, it was like New Jersey Family or something, and someone was writing an article about like, I think it was like talking to your kids about race. And it seemed from the title like so lovely, but like within like the first paragraph, I saw that it was written for white parents. right? And so it was like, well, this doesn't help me. But the fact that it was centering whiteness, but it never said, how do white parents talk to their kids about race? It just said, how do parents talk about race? So like, that's an example of white supremacy, right? That it was centering whiteness, but never calling it out that this is for white people, right? And so you could see that all over the place, right? I mean, why did decades ago, did Essence magazine need to happen? Black entertainment television, right? Why do Black people need to create their own things, right? It's because they're not centered in all these other things. You know, I had to wait like 30 something years to see like see lots of options of Black actors and Black models and things like that. So I think those are all ways of like that anti-Blackness culture. And it's only in the last few years that I've used that language of anti-Blackness culture, right? It's all the ways in which, like I think about Colin Kaepernick and how he took the knee, it was like 2016, 2017, and that was his way of starting to protest. It was so peacefully done, and yet people were outraged, which was racism in effect, but people didn't call it that. They called it disrespect and all this other stuff. But like, I think there are all these ways in which Black people are policed, in which the closer you are to whiteness, the more privilege you gain. And I think some other ways that we see, like when we talk about good schools, you know, where it's coded language for white schools or predominantly white schools. If you look at like just a lot of, there's so many ways, you know, there are so many movies. Oh, I'm gonna blank on what the movie is called, but there are a lot of movies that are white savior movies, right? Like the moral of the story is that a white person comes and helps out Black people, right? Teachers and adopted parents and all these ways, which the moral of the story is that Black people can't do it on their own, right? Which is not true. It's that they're not allowed to. There are all these barriers for that to happen. How do I keep the conversation going when it goes to camping on opposite positions? Yeah, I think I speak for myself is one of my favorite anti-racist psychologists who I consider a mentor, Dr. Kenneth Hardy. I love how he talks about being okay with rage, particularly from people of color. But I also like that he talks about, I just posted it today, it was something like, when I speak, it's for the liberation of my own soul, not to change other people. So if you're having a conversation with someone in order to change them, then it's probably not going to go very far unless they're very open to changing. Because, but if you're having it because this is your own experience, or this is what you're discerning, or this is what you're figuring out about yourself, this is what you're wrestling with, that sounds so different. That's much more vulnerable. It's easy to point the finger at people. It's much harder to point the finger at yourself and own where you are, where you've been. So I think checking in with how people are feeling, having compassion, having a sense of how could they think any other way, right? Because unless they've been exposed to something different, unless they've done their own inner work, right? Can you meet them where they're at and invite them further into the conversation? Patience, it's a long game, right? This is a marathon, not a sprint. As a white therapist, how do I convey my willingness to talk about race to my Black clients? I think naming it in the room, right? So like, I would love for a white therapist to say, like, how does it feel to have a white therapist? Like, and like, to just like, if they read my body language, if they've said something and they can read my body language, that they can name like, oh, that didn't sit right. Or like, oh, I think that might not have come out in a way that felt good to you, or something that like owns it. Or, you know, if people are dying in the streets and we're watching videos about it, I would hope that you're going to ask about it in therapy, because that's part of my experience. That's part of my trauma, is seeing, which is why I didn't watch the George Floyd videos. Like, I cannot see one more person murdered. Like, that's just not part of my self-care. Has there been any successes in our history, specifically since the civil rights movement in the 60s, that have made any difference? I think there are successes all the time, but I'm like an eternal optimist. I went to see Ta-Nehisi Coates speak last year at Princeton University, and I mean, I just love the way that he writes and talks. But I remember what he said very clearly was that he says that if you look throughout history, there are always Black people revolting, in rebellion, fighting for equal rights. That's always happening. But when we see significant change is when the needs and wants of Black people align with what white people are willing to support. That's when real change happens, and there are windows of time when this happens. And so I think that if I look at my lifetime, I see, which is like 40 something years, I see so much change that has happened. And I also see that people who are of a higher socioeconomic status experience the differences sooner than people who are at lower socioeconomic status, right? So as an educated Black cis woman with a doctorate, and having been a psychologist for a number of years, I have certain privileges that protect me in some ways, right? And so my experience in some ways is exactly like Black people who are in lower socioeconomic, and very different in other ways. And so I always think about, like, I can't look at the exceptions. I need to look at like what the masses are, what's happening to the masses of people, right? And so I think affirmative action was critical in bringing equity, because how could you possibly open doors? The doors were not going to open for Black people. They were not going to open for women, right? And that's who benefited most from affirmative action was white women, right? But that's not the story we tell, right? But if people are not required to do equity, they're not likely to, because people don't like to give up what they have, right? And so that's just the reality of human nature. Blind Side, yes, that was the white savior movie. Thank you for Carrie for naming that. That's the one I couldn't think of. That's a great white savior movie. How do you develop or participate in anti-racism as a white savior? I mean, without looking like or acting like. Oh yes, great. I was going to say you can't do them both. I think doing your own inner work, right? To kind of ask yourself, why am I doing this? How am I doing this? Doing a power analysis. So what's my social location? Like, what part of me is front and center right now and like being seen? And what's my relationship as a group, as a system, right? To the person that I'm trying to help, right? And so it really is about, how do I listen, right? Which I think for some white people, it's really hard to just listen, right? To just listen and support what Black, Indigenous, people of color say that they need and want. Just get out of the way, or use your power and privilege to help them along the way, but let them lead. Like one of the examples I heard was, you know, over the years in terms of like Black Lives Matter protests, is white people who are allies putting their bodies in front of Black lives, in front of police officers, because white people are less likely to be murdered by police officers. And so that is a great way, but I'm sure that's terrifying for white people, to put your body in front of another body, in front of a police officer. But that's true allyship, right? Is to say that this matters to me so much, right? That I see that there's something missing from my own life from being a white person. And so like, I'm willing to put my life at risk. I mean, that's true advocacy. All right, I got through all the questions with like a minute to spare. All right, this is great. Thank you so much for these questions. It's fantastic. I'm just gonna share my screen one more time because I want you to see this. I'm so heartened by you all coming. And if I could share, I would share. But my mouse is doing something funny. Well, what I would have shared with you is if you feel inclined to donate, which is one of the ways to be in allyship, is there's this wonderful podcast locally in the Philly area called Opt In. It's a great way to support. There's also the Minnesota Freedom Fund, which is something that helps fund bail and cash bonds, which is a major way that people are incarcerated because so many people do not have the funds to get themselves out if they're arrested for protest or any number of things. And to check out my website, mmcounselingcenter.com, which has a lot of anti-racism resources there. So if you want to dive deeper into this topic or you want to contact me to chat more, those are great places to do that. So thank you so much for spending a little bit of your Thursday evening. I hope that it sparked a little bit of curiosity, and I look forward to us being on this journey toward anti-racism together. Thank you, Erica, so much for sponsoring this.
Natalie, thank you. That was really absolutely unbelievable. You're such a gifted presenter, and from such deep appreciation, I'm sure, from everyone here. Thank you so much for all your offering. We really appreciate it. Thank you, my friend. Namaste, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, Natalie.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank
Natalie.
you.